And we're recording. I'm going to share that there screen if I can get it back up and running again. Aha.
Speaking of David Bly, here he is. I'd tell you he'd be here tonight. Welcome, David.
Well, good evening, folks, and welcome to the Smitty Story Hour. We'll get started in just a few moments. During this time, if you would take a moment to add your name, class year, and where you're joining us from into the chat. We'd love to know where we're hearing from tonight. Sue Alexander. Hey, Coach. Tara Butcher. Stuart Buchanan. Ron. Aren't you supposed to be grading papers right now, Ron? Peter Whitchurch. Mark Caulfield. Jimmy Hodges, way over in Lake Placid. Homer Reese. David Bly. Oh, we knew that. Craig Maluski. Let's see.
My neighbor, David Sponable, here in Beekmantown. He's not too far away from me.
Nice. Stephen Frederick from West AZ. Who knew? I can't read their, Move that over. So we'll get started in just a few moments. Let's let folks have a chance to log on. Thank you for joining us for the Smitty Story Hour tonight, featuring Corey Laxson, class of '98. We have other Smitty Story Hours coming up soon, June 10th and June 24th. June 10th, we'll welcome Dan Kelting from the AWI. June 24th, we have two alums, Mike Recklin, you may have heard of him, Paul Pillis, you might know him too. They'll be joining us together, possibly with other guest stars as well. So stay tuned. Let's see, who can see your message? That doesn't matter. Let's see. Brett Wimsat in Vermontville, class of 2017. I hope I'm saying your name right, Brett. I apologize if I'm not. Homer Reese is in Portland, Oregon. It's where my oldest son lives, in Portland. He's working on his garden these days till his restaurant reopens. Mike Recklin was the original Swampy. Who knew? Those that have just joined us, if you would please jump onto chat, put your name, class year, where you're joining us from. We'll get started in just a few moments. Tonight, of course, we have Corey Laxson from class of '98. The Smitty Story Hour is brought to you by the Paul Smith College Alumni Association. Oh, Mark Caulfield, how's Connecticut tonight? Surveyor, class of '82. Love that program. Sean Boland, Cold Spring, New York. Sean Patton, class of '15, Boise, Idaho. Rick Jimenez, class of '65. Rick, where are you tonight? see, still waiting for Peter and Karen. John in Philadelphia, class of 66. Karen, 83. There she is, Karen Frank, with the dog Rocket. Peter probably kicking around somewhere in the background. I think he had a meeting tonight, though. Sean Patton says, hi, Corey. So as we've done in the past, I just want to remind folks, any questions you have throughout tonight's presentation, just throw them into the chat or into the Q&A. At the end of our session, Corey will ask for questions and I'll read them off and he'll answer to the best of his ability. I'm sure he'll do fine. Mark Caulfield says, daffodils crushed by hail 2 weeks ago. My daffodils just came up, so there's that. Rick is joining us from Arkansas, Hot Springs Village, Arkansas. Now, is it Hot Springs or is it Hot in Springs Village? I wonder. Oh, and when you're commenting and asking questions, please put your questions to all attendees, not just panelists. They can't see what you're saying. So if you put it all panelists and attendees, maybe that's something I need to do. Haha. Hey, this will be fun. I don't know if we had frost on campus this morning. Do you guys know?
No.
It's pretty darn close at my house. I didn't turn on the heat in my car, but I did turn on the heated seats. So, you know, kind of cheating, I suppose. It was 29 at Sue Alexander's house this morning. Yep, that makes. Yes, downtown in a van by the river. That's right, Tara. Somebody watched our graduation video. All right, Corey, I think we're about ready. So folks, we are recording. Welcome tonight to the Smitty Story Hour featuring Professor Corey Laxson. Any questions you have throughout the evening, please throw them into chat or the Q&A. The Smitty Story Hour series is brought to you by the Paul Smith College Alumni Association and is recorded and will be posted for future viewing to the alumni webpage. With that, Corey, you're welcome to take over if you're ready.
All right. Thank you so much, Heather. So I'm assuming you'll tell me if my my screen share isn't working.
Well, I can see you, Corey. I cannot see your presentation. It's almost as if the presentation might be behind you. Oh, wait, there we go.
I can see Corey.
All right, it's just me. Never mind. Ignore me, Corey.
Everybody else can see it.
Yeah. So thank you, everyone, for tuning in. I'm really excited to do this. I think this is a really great idea to talk to alumni and share some shared experiences. And hopefully you'll be interested in this talk. I'm going to talk about Lower St. Regis Lake, which we're all so familiar with. And what I'm going to talk about is the condition of the lake and really the degradation of the lake that's occurred in recent history and how that's changed over time and how we've reached what we might call some ecological redemption for the lake. Before I even get too far into that, I need to take some time to acknowledge a lot of the other faculty, both retired and current faculty and staff that have been really important in understanding Lower St. Regis Lake. And I'm sure a lot of you in the audience are familiar with a lot of these faces. None of this would have been possible. Our understanding of the lake would not be possible without the contributions of retired Professor Pat Flath, Mike Recklin, as well as some of my current colleagues here, Craig Maluski, Kurt Stager, and a lot of this data and work has actually been done by the Paul Smith College Watershed Institute. So I have to acknowledge my colleague Elizabeth Yerger, Dan Kelting, Brendan Wiltsey, and Leah Trebergs, who have been really influential. So I just got to get that out of the way because this really isn't my work. This is a summation of a work that a lot of people have done over the last 50 years, which is pretty unbelievable. So let me start with the college alma mater. And I'm sure you all remember this really awkward experience at graduation where we sing this song and we're like, why are we singing at graduation? The college song has the lyrics, "On the shores of fair St. Regis, stand the mighty pines, alma mater hails her faithful to the end of time." And I think every time I hear that song, I think about this word, on the shores of fair St. Regis. And when I hear the word fair, I'm like, it means, you know, it's okay, it's fair. And, you know, in the 50s, the 60s, and 70s, that word fair was pretty true of the lake. In fact, if you were here in the 60s and the 70s, you might have suggested that the alma mater be changed to on the shores of poor St. Regis, because the condition of the lake had really deteriorated at that point. So, you know, I don't really need to explain the location of this story very much. You're all very familiar with Lower St. Regis Lake, with the value of the lake, with the beauty of the resource. It's a 350-acre lake. It's the gateway to the St. Regis canoe area to the south, and St. Lawrence River to the north. So whether you're a student or a resident or a visitor, you know, loading a canoe for a backcountry trip into the canoe area, Lower St. Regis Lake is an amazing place, and it's a point where a lot of great Adirondack days begin, right on Lower St. Regis Lake. And, you know, that was the way it was in 1858 as well, when Apollo Smith, who was 33 years old at the time, sat on a ridge with one of his clients, Daniel Sanders, and looked out at that beautiful lake and contemplated that location as his next business venture. The lake was amazing, beautiful place as well. It still seemed to be that way anyway in the 1930s, in the 1940s, as the Paul Smith Hotel, what didn't burn down, as the hotel and its extensive land holdings began to be morphed into the present day Paul Smith College. But however, by the 1960s, something really noticeable had changed. And the change to the lake actually started much sooner. But as you know, environmental disturbances go, it went largely unnoticed until it exploded on the scene. But if you were standing on the lakeshore in the late 60s, early 70s, I can guarantee you'd think twice about going on a canoe trip. Certainly wouldn't probably be very interested in fishing. And in certain times of the year, I don't think many people would have jumped in the water. Often during the summer months at that time, the lake was covered with obnoxious thick blooms of cyanobacteria, and the transparency of the lake, the depth at which you can see down into the lake, often was 1.5 feet. The cold bottom waters of the lake were completely devoid of oxygen, and the native strain of brook trout were gone, and the fish community was replaced with a community that was dominated by white suckers. So what I want to talk about today is how did we get to this point that we see in this picture, and how has it changed, and what can we learn from it? Now, there's lots of places where I could start this story, but I'm going to start it, you know, about halfway through the 19th century. I'm going to start with the arrival of Apollo Smith. So in 1850, well, actually starting in 1848, Paul Smith started operating a guiding business in the area. He was working on a loon lake. First, he rented a place on Loon Lake to operate his business, but by 1952, he was working out of Hunter's Home, which is just south of Loon Lake on the north branch of the Saranac River. This is actually a picture of Hunter's Home that I have to throw my 2 cents to Mark Warner at the historic Saranac Lake, who recently dug up this image of Hunter's Home. This picture was actually taken in 1865, and at that time, Paul Smith was no longer involved with this particular hotel. But he was at Hunter's Home on the North Branch of the Saranac River. It was, as you can see in this picture, is a primitive 2-story lodge. It had a big kitchen and a big living room on the ground floor. And then up on the top were really thinly partitioned sleeping quarters. And there was no provisions in this hotel for ladies of the time. In 1850, most of the guests that came here were rich, affluent males who were doctors and lawyers from the surrounding cities like New York and Boston. This was not the type of place where you brought an affluent lady from the city. It was rough. It was, you know, drafty and dirty, and you were out hunting and fishing. Board at Hunter's Home and lodging was $1.25 a day. And if for the guide service, it was another $2 a day. But, you know, you could fill your cup from a barrel of whiskey in the corner for about 4 cents. So it was a great place if you were interested in being out in the wild and hunting and fishing. On the story goes, on one particular excursion, Paul Smith and one of his clients, Daniel Sanders, who was a very well-known lawyer from the Massachusetts area, went on this long expedition, this hunting and fishing trip. As you can see in the map here, they actually traveled from Loon Lake up the North Branch of the river into Round Pond, which is now called Lake Kushiqua, through the Rainbow Lake chain, Jones Pond, Osgood Pond, and then onto the shores of Follansbee Lake, which is now called Lower St. Regis Lake. And after a long day of fishing, they sat up on a ridge overlooking this beautiful lake. And, you know, the story goes that Daniel Sanders said to Paul while they were eating lunch, you know, I really love coming up here. This is fantastic, but you got to make a nicer place, a place where I could bring my wife. How about right here? This is a great spot. And, you know, after that conversation, Paul was very interested in the idea. He was also really interested in the location, because this location on Lower St. Regis was a large connected water bodies with several lakes. It was close to one of the few roads that cut through the wilderness at that time. And perhaps one of the most important things that's often overlooked is it had a really cool source of fresh spring water that is still here at this present day. It's below the student center, but it still pops out of the ground and runs into the lake. And that was an important thing to have in the 1850s as a source of good fresh spring water. So Paul talked about this with some of his other influential guests, and they were all on board. And so Paul purchased 50 acres on the shores of Lower St. Regis Lake. It took all the money that he had to buy it, $300. But didn't have any money left to build a lodge. So he actually borrowed $13,000 from one of his clients, Dr. Loomis, and used it to construct his 17-room hunting lodge, which we see here, the picture on the left. This is what was called at the time St. Regis House. The picture on both of these pictures, I believe they are the oldest pictures that we have of the College Hotel. So on the left, the St. Regis House, it was a 17-room house. I'm not sure at this point in the photo what year it was. I suspect it was probably the late 1860s or very, very early 1870s, based on the lack of additions that are on the building. What we're seeing right here where these 3 dormers are, this is the original St. Regis House. So it already has an addition on it here and an addition to the far right. And then over here is on the right-hand photo is the original boathouse, not the original guide house, the original boathouse, which was located where the present-day canoe launch is. So the St. Regis House was open for business in the summer of 1859. So a really important question that comes up is, you know, what did the lake look like then? What was the lake like? What was the water quality like in 1858 or 1859 when the St. Regis House opened? Well, we don't really know. We can infer several things, and there's lots of photo evidence. I mean, one thing for sure, the water was a lot lower because the St. Regis Dam was not the size it was later. There was a sawmill, but not the bigger power dam. This picture on the left is actually a picture of the point that we're also familiar with. This picture was taken from the hotel which sat up on a ridge. So, you know, we don't know exactly what the lake looked like, but there's a really great reference, some really great writing that gives us an indication of the quality of the lake. And it was written by William C. Prime in a book called I Go A-Fishing, published in 1860. It's kind of like a fishing guide memoir type book that was written in 1860. And I got to give a shout out to Craig Maluski for finding this really awesome historical reference about the lake. Let me read this passage to you. It's like a little bedtime story here. This is what William C. Prime wrote about Lower St. Regis Lake in 1860. So this is from I Go A-Fishing. He says, from him, speaking of an old guide, I learned that brook trout were abundant in one part of the pond by the house. The fish rose at every cast, and when I had a half a dozen of the same sort, a little less than 2 pounds, and 1 ounce shy of 4 pounds, we pulled up the anchor and paddled for shore. So in the book, Prime is talking about a place where you can catch 2 to 4 pound brook trout on almost every cast. He ended up writing later on in 1872, 12 years later, he wrote in another article, he wrote, I looked out across the pond to Peter's Rock and wondered whether trout would rise to a fly over there as in years before. So we know the lake was full of native brook trout, and we can infer something about the water quality of the lake with that information. Well, the expansion of Paul Smith's Hotel began almost immediately after it was built in 1859, especially during the Civil War era when the Conscription Act allowed soldiers to be drafted. Rich people from the city could buy their way out of the Conscription Act. And then in order to not be, you know, have food and waste thrown at them in the street and heckled out of town, a lot of them came up here and hid out at Paul Smith's Hotel. So business was booming during the Civil War, and expansion began immediately. Look at this picture on the upper left. What we're looking, a couple important things here is you can see that the hotel was actually positioned up on a ridge looking over the water. This ridge, based on some photo evidence, I would say is anywhere from 15 to 20 feet high. Here is the original St. Regis house. Here's an addition on the east side, an addition back here, another addition over here. And even a ground floor, as you can see in this photo, a ground floor was put on. The hill was dug out from underneath. Expansion continued. This photo is from the mid-1800s during what I call the brown phase of the hotel. You can see further expansion, and it's also a really good shot of the fact that the hotel was actually up on a hill. Down here at the bottom is a photo from 1903, which is a really nice comparison because you can see that that hill is gone. A lot of changes occurred around Paul Smith's, and one of the most important changes is an unbelievable amount of land moving. I don't mean forest clearing, I mean moving land. And you can see that hill is completely gone now. So expansion really took off. And you know, the St. Regis house grew to, as you all know, a world-renowned Paul Smith's Hotel. So it increased from 17 rooms in 1859 to 255 rooms by 1903. Not only that, 255 rooms, that's a lot of rooms, but there was also 17 cottages, 2 employee dormitories, a stable that could fit 60 horses, 7 boathouses, 2 laundry facilities, a whole bunch of support buildings, a store, a sawmill, and a golf course. I have an antique map on my wall of the hotel from 1914, and just before I started this talk, I counted 65 buildings, which is about, you know, 3 times more than there are now. Not only did Paul Smith's Hotel expand, but the whole shoreline of the St. Regis chain went through rapid development. Well before the close of the 19th century, Paul Smith owned 30,000 acres around the lake chain. And hotel guests that came to the hotel really enjoyed it. They wanted their own piece of the Adirondacks, so Paul Smith would sell them property. And he would use his employees to build them camps with lumber that he cut from his forest and milled on his sawmill. And a lot of this property was purchased by the end of the 19th century, and some of it sold for $4,000 an acre in 1896. So really filled up quickly. So, you know, here's the really important question, all right? Where did all these people go to the bathroom in the hotel? And it sounds kind of silly, right? But it's actually a really important question. We don't know, but plumbing seems to have existed in the hotel well before the end of the 19th century. We don't know when flushable toilets were put in Paul Smith's hotel. The early St. Regis house almost certainly used outhouses. In fact, Edward Trudeau, the prominent doctor who came to Paul Smith's hotel in the 1870s, he describes fetching water from a spring at the base of the hill. That was how they got water for the hotel. So there was no running water in the hotel in 1874, but at some point flush toilets were introduced, and we don't know when that was. I'm sure by the 1880s there was flush toilets, because the first flush toilets arrived in hotels as early as 1829. So the technology existed. And Paul Smith was very familiar with hotels because he traveled to New York City, Montreal, even went to Tampa and down in Florida during the winter. We also know from evidence in the Paul Smith College archive that the hotel had pressurized water in 1886 from a well up on Easy Street Creek, which is like 400 feet above elevation from the hotel, and the water was piped to the hotel, so it would have been under pressure. So there were early toilets in the hotel. We're not exactly sure what happened, but where did that waste go when the toilet was flushed? The waste would flow through vitrified clay pipes, leave the hotel, and go into pits, dry cesspool type pits. They were lined with hemlock logs, hemlock cribbing or bricks, and the solids would remain in the pit while the nutrient-rich water would slowly percolate into the ground or even the nearby lake. As you can see in this illustration, one of the big issues here is these were often built very close to the water, and the water table would interfere with the bottom of the dry cesspool, allowing a tremendous amount of organic material and nutrients to make it into the lake. There are some of these antique cesspools that still exist on campus, or remains of them. Here's one of them. This is a remains of one of these Drywell dry cesspools that existed in Paul Smith's area. This one is on the eastern side of the lake, in the proximity of what was the Ferry family camp. It was part of the hotel, later became the Bluebird cabins. This is where the ropes course is. What you see in this depression right here is the remains of one of these dry cesspools for sewage disposal. I took this picture last year, and I'm glad I did, because a giant white pine fell, and now it's a big white pine laying over the top of that archaeological find of an old sewage hole. Here's another one. This is another antique dry well. This is behind President's Point or Kellogg Point for you old timers. This once handled the waste of 3 hotel cottages up on Kellogg Point. This is a cement dry well. And you can see in this picture, there's the dry well, and then there is vitrified clay pipe. This is where the liquid from the wastewater would drain out into the lake. In this photo, I am standing in the lake. That pipe that drained in the water is less than 11 feet from the mean watermark of the lake. So expansion of the hotel, expansions of all around the St. Regis chain, must have had a negative impact on the water quality of the lake. In fact, we know that it did. We have evidence that by 1900, all of this development and poor wastewater disposal was having an impact on the lake. Here, what I want to share with you is, how we know that the lake was having trouble as early as the 1900s. Because I was a resident of Upper St. Regis Lake, shared with me a memorandum of understanding that was signed in 1901 by the St. Regis Property Owners Association. And it was signed by some really influential and well-known people, like Dr. Edward Trudeau, the tuberculosis doctor. He was also a resident doctor for the St. Regis chain for over 30 years. It was signed by Phelps Smith, Paul's son. It was signed by Dr. James, W.B. James, who was a renowned physician. He actually took over the sanatorium when Trudeau died. and also signed by H.L. Hotchkiss. H.L. Hotchkiss was a Civil War Navy veteran. He served with the famous Admiral David Farragut, and he was a Wall Street power player, and he's credited with inventing the stock ticker, the thing for the stock market. These are a couple well-known people that signed this memorandum of understanding. Now, let me take a second to read this to you. I think this is fascinating. This is 1901. Whereas it is the unanimous sentiment of the meeting of persons owning or occupying land lying upon Upper St. Regis, Spitfire, and Lower St. Regis Lake, that the practice of allowing sewage, wastewater, or other refuse to be thrown into the lake is a menace not only to the comfort, but also to the health and safety of all persons residing upon the shores of those lakes. Therefore, be it all owners of property lying on adjacent to Spectacle Lake, Bog Pond, Upper Spitfire, and Lower St. Regis Lake be earnestly requested to sign a document in which they shall promise, each for his, her, and their own land or camp, that after June 1st, 1902, they will allow no sewage, kitchen or laundry waste, water, or other refuse of any kind whatsoever to be thrown or drained into any one of the above mentioned lakes or streams draining into those lakes. Also, that they will not build or continue to use any dry well or cesspool at a distance less than 30 feet from the shores of these waters. So what condition was the lake in to spur a resolution like this? You have to believe that it was definitely noticeable by 1901. And kudos to the St. Regis Property Owners Association for this very early environmental movement that occurred on the lake. Did this resolution help? We don't know, because there is no data or any documentation of the condition of the lake for the next 30 years. The next time we have any information about the lake is in 1930. So despite the property owners, attempt, it seems like the conditions of the lake actually continue to get bad, to get worse. In 1930, the biological survey of the St. Lawrence Watershed took place by the Environmental Conservation Department, a predecessor of the DEC. They came to a lot of lakes in the St. Lawrence Watershed. They came to Lower St. Regis Lake. There's not a lot of chemistry data in that 1930 report that indicates the water quality condition, except for that there are transparency measurements, which report that the visibility of the lake was less than 2 meters, and that there was blooms, algae blooms of Anabina and Microcystis in August. And these are two species of cyanobacteria or blue-green algae that are known to form obnoxious blooms and potentially be toxic. Again, after 1930, we have no data about the lake, no observations about the lake for another 30 years. It isn't until 1963 that we see some documentation again. And this is what happens in 1963 is we have documentation that residents on the lake chain are talking about these algae blooms. And they're noting that the blooms are appearing earlier and persisting longer. So, they were used to having blooms at that point, but what they're noticing is not the blooms, is that they're happening earlier and they're staying on longer. So cyanobacteria were a problem. Nutrient enrichment from wastewater must have been a problem. If we go from there to 1964, this is a really important year for the college. This is 1964, Paul Smith College sees its largest enrollment jump ever, or at least in the first 20 years that the college was open. I mean, it went up by like 130 students in 1 year. Also, what's noticeable about 1964 is that there was a heavy cyanobacteria bloom in the lake that lasted the entire summer. So that was something that was very noticeable. And researchers from Cornell University were nearby because these fisheries biologists were working up at Bay Pond at the fish hatchery. And so they saw what was going on, and they believed that the water quality issues were caused by sewage pollution from the college. And the blame on the college was warranted in some ways. The college existed on the same outdated wastewater disposal used during the hotel era. Dry wells, antiquated leach fields, septic tanks that were old. I mean, the college was built on the skeleton of the hotel. I mean, the first academic building was the laundry facility for the hotel. So, you know, as the college grew, it just sort of piggybacked on old infrastructure of the hotel, including the wastewater disposal. Is this the college's fault? No, this was the way waste was handled at the time. And it was handled like that everywhere. So 1965, a proposal was put forth that a wastewater treatment plant would alleviate this problem on Lower St. Regis Lake. So we have to abandon these antiquated dry cesspools and leach fields that were often noted to overflow during the spring, during the high water season. They would just be bubbling out of the ground. So a proposal was put forth to build a wastewater treatment plant, and construction began almost immediately on a wastewater treatment plant that was used for small municipalities around the United States. So in 1967, the wastewater treatment plant goes online, the same wastewater treatment plant we have today. And what that wastewater treatment plant did at the time was provide primary wastewater treatment and secondary wastewater treatment. So what that means is primary wastewater treatment means when the sewage comes in through the sewage pipe, primary treatment works through sedimentation. So all the solids in the wastewater stream settle out and are separated from the liquid, which is called liquor. So that's those solids that settle out can then be removed. And that's a big part of the organic material in wastewater. From there, the liquor on the top, which has been clarified to a great extent, goes into secondary treatment. And what happens there is it's aerated so that the bacteria in the water will utilize and consume the organic material that's dissolved in the water, use it to build their own biomass, which then settles out. At that point, the water is quite clear and it can be pumped out to the environment. And that's what happened. The wastewater then flowed through a pipe all the way into Easy Street Creek or Weller Brook and was discharged directly into the lake, well into Easy Street Creek. So if we look at it from an aerial view, here's the wastewater treatment plant right here. This is a recent illustration, and there's a pipe that went right to Easy Street Creek that discharged the effluent. That pipe is still there. I bring my class to see it every year. So great news in 1967, right? So the problem is solved, right? We've got a wastewater treatment plant, problem solved, right? No, actually wrong and very wrong. In 1968, a year after the wastewater treatment plant opened, there was particularly heavy blooms noted by the fisheries biologists from Cornell. A quote from one of these biologists is that the entire lake looked like pea soup, and so did the river for 20 miles past the dam. Imagine that, the St. Regis River, 20 miles past the dam is green, not just the lake. So the problem here has to do with the wastewater treatment plant. Bacterial breakdown of wastewater is a very important process, but it results in two main things. It results in bacterial biomass, which is sludge. That can be removed, piled up somewhere, brought to a dump, burned. You know, there's lots of ways of dealing with it. The other thing it produces is very, very nutrient-rich water. After secondary treatment, the dissolved organic material is largely consumed by bacteria, but what's left in this effluent are tremendous amounts of nutrients, phosphorus and nitrogen in particular. This nutrient-rich water was discharged directly to the lake. So here is a picture from the actual effluent pipe going into Lower St. Regis Lake. This picture is from 1972. What we're seeing here is wastewater effluent dropping into the lake. And this white stuff that you see in the picture, that's not snow. That's suds, soap suds, organic material sudsing up. So the problem herein lies the problem. The waste from 1,000 campus users was going to the wastewater treatment plant, being converted into a steady stream of usable nutrients that are being dropped directly into the lake, and detergents. And the big problem here, the nutrient of particular concern, is phosphorus. Phosphorus is a really important nutrient for all biological life. It's in DNA, RNA, it's in bones, it's in ATP. It's very, very important for physiology. But it exists in very, very low amounts in freshwater systems. It doesn't lend itself very easily to the water. It doesn't weather very quickly from the watershed. So all the other important nutrients usually exist in high amounts, but not phosphorus. So if you add a little bit of phosphorus, you get a huge outbreak of biological productivity. So that effluent pipe was discharging about 1,280 micrograms per liter at any given time of phosphorus into Easy Street Creek or Weller Brook. Just upstream from that discharge pipe, Weller Brook is only naturally carrying 20 micrograms per liter. And the result is the lake had very, very high levels of dissolved reactive phosphorus, this really important nutrient. Some later research that was done on the wastewater treatment plant, and some of you may have been here and done some of that work, the college treatment plant was discharging an average of 1,200 pounds of phosphorus a year to the lake. That might not sound like very much, but it is a tremendous amount. In fact, it's 46% of all the phosphorus that goes into the lake. 46% of it was coming from that pipe. And that's pretty significant contribution, that almost half the phosphorus in the whole lake came from that pipe, because the campus itself only makes up about 0.4% of the watershed size. So the lake was continuing to be in really rough shape. In 1970, residents on the upper lakes had enough, and they issued a formal complaint to the New York State Department of Health in 1970. And in 1971, the New York State Department of Health responded. They sent one of their premier water scientists, who's pictured here on the left, G.W. Fuse, and his assistant to campus. They came with a boat and they came with a plane. So they came with a boat to do a one-time sampling, and they came with a plane to get an aerial view of the condition of the lake. And this is what they saw, this famous picture from August 1971. And G.W. Fuse writes that he was both impressed and shocked by the condition of the lake. And they surmised and agreed that it was phosphorus loading. It was from the wastewater treatment plant. If that phosphorus effluent could be stopped, then the lake perhaps could be restored to its natural state. It's important to recognize that Lower St. Regis Lake was not alone in this problem. This is not a Paul Smith College problem. This is a global problem, especially at that time. Late 60s, early 70s was the height of the environmental movement, of which Lake Erie was the forefront, right? And Lake Erie was in just dire conditions at this time. I mean, it was a joke that Lake Erie was dying, and it was an open cesspool. Of the 62 beaches on Lake Ontario, on the American side of Lake Erie, I'm sorry, 62 beaches, only 3 were open for swimming in 1969. So the same thing was happening in Lake Erie, was happening in Lower St. Regis Lake, but at a much smaller scale. So as I move through this timeline, I want to go to 1971, 1972. These are really important pivotal years for this story, because this is the time period where Paul Smith College began construction of the sand percolation beds that still exist today across the street on Route 30. What this did was divert the effluent coming directly out of the wastewater treatment plant to the lake. Instead, it pumped it up across the street, across Route 30, into 4 large sand percolation beds, where that effluent could then slowly percolate through 90 feet of glacial sand before hitting the water table. And that was believed that would result in 100% phosphorus removal. That project was scheduled to be completed in 1974, and it was completed, and it's still being used today. Here's a picture of one of the sand percolation beds that's up across the street. Also during that time, a really important step that occurred is that the newly formed Environmental Protection Agencies, the EPA, initiated this study called the National Eutrophication Study. And it was a $4.2 million project. They were looking for lakes. They were looking for lakes that were suffering from eutrophication, meaning elevated amounts of nutrients were causing rapid biological productivity in algae blooms. That's what eutrophication means. They were looking for lakes that had this problem, and in lakes that in a relatively short time span, maybe the problem could be solved. Lower St. Regis Lake was one of these lakes. There was 812 lakes chosen by the end of the study. The very first year, the EPA chose 200 lakes, and Lower St. Regis Lake was one of them. So now the EPA is here looking at Lower St. Regis Lake because it's an excellent example of nutrient pollution and eutrophication. Well, the college president at the time, Chester Buxton, he recognized that the college needs to get out in front of this story. EPA is here because our lake is in such bad condition. We need to get out in front of this, you know. So Buxton sent a memo to the chemistry professor, young chemistry professor by the name of Pat Flath, and suggested to Pat, as she told me, that she should start a club to shadow the EPA in their investigation of the lake and shadow their chemical investigation of what's going on in the lake. And Pat Flath told me that when Buxton suggested you do something, you did it. She didn't know anything about lakes. She knew very little about analyzing water quality samples. And she just told me she didn't even know what the word ecology meant. But nonetheless, she put out an advertisement for the starting of a club. And this club was called the Lower St. Regis Lake Research Program. And 40 pre-professional forestry students applied to be part of this club to work with the EPA. Of the 40, 13 were chosen. And Pat told me she thought the project would last no more than 2 years and she'd be done with it. It lasted over 20 years. And this is the first report that these students put out in January of 1972, outlining their findings in the Lower St. Regis Lake Research Project. Here's a nice wood carved sign that hung above the lab, LSR LRP, which was known by the words LaSlurp to recognize that program. This project was incredibly popular, super, super popular. It was so popular that within 3 years, a full-blown major was put on the books by Paul Smith's college called Ecology and Environmental Technology, EET program. It was absolutely the perfect place and the perfect time for that program because the Clean Water Act of 1972 had created a huge job boom for understanding aquatic ecology, for understanding environmental analysis and water quality sampling, chemical analysis, wastewater treatment. So Paul Smith's College just exploded onto that scene with a very, very popular program, this EET program. This EET program in 1974 was really the first real science program at Paul Smith's College. I know forestry is a science, so I know that, but this was the real first science-y program at Paul Smith's College. And it was so popular that more science programs continued to be put on the books. So it started off with EET, eventually gave rise to environmental studies, which gave rise, to 4-year programs in 1998, like biology. Later, the Fish and Wildlife Science program, environmental science, ecological restoration, human health and the environment. All of these natural science programs that are so important to Paul Smith's College, they all have their root in this Lower St. Regis Lake Research Project and the condition of the lake at that time. So, now in 2020, I want to ask the question, has the lake recovered? What's going on with the lake now? The wastewater treatment plant, was it put online? Everything was solved, at least we think, right? So has it recovered? And, to answer that question, that's a hard question to answer because lake recovery is a very complicated topic, all right? Because the ecology of the lake and its watershed have been totally altered. You can't just go back to normal. And also, what is normal? Do we want it to go back to normal? Does normal Lower St. Regis Lake 14,000 years ago when the glaciers receded? Is it 150 years ago when Paul Smith had lunch with Daniel Sanders overlooking the lake? So it's really impossible to return to a previous state because we don't even know what that state would be. And the ecology of the lake has been fundamentally shifted or altered. Having said that, though, there are some really positive and encouraging signs that the lake has changed. Let me walk you through some of the data briefly in a simplistic way. What this graph is showing is the change in transparency of the lake since 1967. So the way this figure works is 0 is on the top, that's the depth. So the very top of this graph represents the surface of the lake. You can just imagine like a boat up there or something. What each of these dots represent is the average depth at which you can see down into the lake and identify a Secchi disk, a white and black disk. So as you can see in the early 1967, the transparency was about 0.5 meter. But that has significantly improved, and it improved quickly. And now it fluctuates more around 2 or 3 meters as opposed to 0.5 meter. The lake is not particularly clear. It is a brown lake, but that is really a function of the watershed. There's a lot of wetlands in the watershed. 13% of the watershed is comprised of wetlands, which rinse lots of dissolved organic material in the lake, giving it that brown color and sort of naturally low transparency. Here's a map showing algal biomass measured by chlorophyll. So again, on the x-axis are the years. On the y-axis is the chlorophyll concentration, starting from 0 at the bottom and up to 18. You can measure chlorophyll as a surrogate measure of algal abundance. It's much cheaper, quicker, and easier than counting algae. And what you can see is the algae abundance was very high in the 70s and has since dropped off and is continuing to drop off. And no lake-wide significant algae bloom has been observed since the mid-1970s. Finally, this is the total phosphorus concentration. Remember, phosphorus is a really important nutrient for growth. In 1967, it was up as high as 87 micrograms per liter, which is insanely high. Since then, it's really dropped, and it's continuing to drop, and it was at its all-time low this last summer in 2020 at 9.8 micrograms per liter, which is not significantly different from Spitfire or Upper St. Regis. This is a figure showing the overall trophic status. So the trophic condition, this is a method that lake scientists use to classify lakes based on their productivity. So lakes that are eutrophic, they're really green, low transparency, very productive. Oligotrophic are super clear, low productivity, and mesotrophic is in between. And as you can see, all the measurements we take for this trophic index status are dropping. And the lake is more classically defined now as being moderate production rather than very high. So what we like to say is that the lake has experienced not recovery, but ecological redemption. And ecological redemption of the lake is evident. And what that term redemption means, like when you redeem your beer bottles, right? You're regaining possession of something in exchange for payment. So we've regained a lot on Lower St. Regis. We've regained aesthetic quality. It looks good, it smells good. We can swim, fish, canoe. We've regained that recreational value. And we've regained a stable ecosystem function. But it's cost us a lot. We've lost the oxygen in the bottom water of the lake. Still, to this day, every summer, it's anoxic over half the lake. So because of that, there's no more brook trout. There's no more cold water fishery. It's also cost us vigilance. We have to be continuously monitoring, watching the lakes, acting as a steward of the lake's watershed. The other issue with recovery is that it's really also really complicated because there's lots of things going on in the lake and in the watershed besides sewage treatment. There's complex interactions with all sorts of other environmental disturbances. There's road salt going on. We've got, nearby anyway, non-native species, invasive species. There's a changing climate, changes to acid deposition. All of these things are happening to the lake, which makes it really hard to tease apart recovery from all of these things. Here on this graph here is one example, which is one of the more striking influences that we're having on the lake right now. And this is the amount of salt in the lake. The lake is definitely becoming more salty. This is the chloride concentration, the changes in the chloride concentration since 1972. Really shocking increase in chloride. Most lakes in the Adirondacks that don't have any roads in their watershed have chloride concentrations of about 0.2 milligrams per liter. In Lower St. Regis, it's 27. So, it's about 120 times higher than it should be. And this is from the application of de-icing agents and road salt on the roads in the watershed but also on the Paul Smith College campus. Now, New York State uses a tremendous amount of salt on the roads. 200,000 tons of road salt are applied to the state roads in the Adirondacks every year. And if you do the math, it's about 36 tons of salt per lane mile in the watershed. But Paul Smith College adds a lot of salt too. In some years, as much as 280 tons of salt in 1 year are applied to the campus. And it's going into the lake, as you can see in this figure. So the take-home messages here for this talk are really a couple things. One is that persistent pollution can really have severe ecological results, even if that pollution is seemingly minor and it occurs very slowly over a long period of time. And these environmental disturbances go unnoticed for a long time until it's too late. Another really important point I hope you leave with is that Lower St. Regis Lake played a really important role in the environmental movement of the 1960s and 70s. And the condition of the lake, what happened to the lake, the beauty of the lake brought Paul Smith here. The degradation of the lake really was a seed for a lot of our science programs at Paul Smith's. And that Lower St. Regis Lake is in a lot better shape right now and has definitely experienced ecological redemption, but that has come at a high cost as well. So that's my presentation. So I'd be happy to take some questions now. I know I went a little bit long, Heather, but you know.
No, it's all good. It was
Stuff to
actually
talk
very
about.
interesting. I didn't realize the time until you got to that last slide. I was like, oh my goodness. So Tara Butcher asks, what fish species live in the lake now?
So the lake now, you know, the fish community consists of largemouth bass, pumpkin seeds, a warm water fish primarily, bullhead, northern pike. Recently, black crappie have been introduced into the lake, which do very well. There are some yellow perch. Their numbers seem to be declining. So it's primarily a warm water fishery at this point. Brook trout occasionally are caught in the lake because they come in from Weller Brook, where there's a population, but they don't persist in the lake very long, especially in the summertime.
Okay. Any explanation for the huge spike in K between 1965 and 67?
In K?
The letter K.
Potassium?
Ron Perlich, that's your question.
Oh, P?
He
This
put
graph?
letter K, so.
Will you repeat the question, Heather?
Any explanation for he meant P, yeah, he just answered. Any
Okay.
explanation for the huge spike in P between 1965 and 67?
So in 65 and 67, these samples represent a single sampling event. They're not taken over the entire summer or the entire year. So at that particular point in time when the sample was taken, it's really high. As we get into 2000 to 2020, you know, these are averages that represent maybe 8 to 12 samples that are taken during the summer. So this is just the only reading we have for that time, and it was a very high concentration on that day.
I'm also noticing there doesn't seem to be any record in 1990-ish. What's going on there?
Yeah, so 70s, 80s, and even the early 90s, we have data, but it's all student lab data, and the quality control on that data is not, it's learning, it's teaching, training data.
Sure.
It's all over the map. There's no quality control, so we're not using it in a scientific analysis. All of these points that I shared with you are from reputable sources, so to speak.
Okay, thank you for that.
Yeah.
Has there been any studies of sediment nutrients, and has there been clean sediment deposit to lock in the poo deposition to lock in the poo? Oh my gosh.
So translation, Heather?
Steve, help me out. It's from David.
Yeah, I'm the
Bly.
non-scientist here, so I think it was David Bly's question.
It sure is.
I think I know what he's getting at. Has there been an analysis of the sediment in the bottom, right, to see what the condition of the mud is in terms of organic material and possible phosphorus loading, right, David? The phosphorus that has been loaded into the lake for decades and decades is largely still in the lake. It cycles really rapidly. It gets assimilated by algae and bacteria, goes up the food web, organisms die, it comes back down to the lake. It takes a long time to remove phosphorus from the bottom water, and it continuously internally loads. So right now, the bottom water of the lake, the bottom mud is full of phosphorus, and it goes anoxic every year. So you get internal loading of phosphorus from the mud in perpetuity. I mean, we don't know when or ever that would stop.
Okay. Mark Caulfield says, thank you, Corey. That explains why my April 1975 tour of the college was 40% explaining the new sewage treatment facility.
Yeah.
The added sand beds component was new information. Thanks for your details of that element. Does there seem to be any reasons why the transparency depth alters very equally in later years? It seems to have, oh my gosh, zigzag trend in the early 2000s.
Yeah. So the main driver of transparency in the lake now is the amount of dissolved organic material that comes in from the watershed. It's just like, you know, making a tea for yourself at home. The more water that flushes through the watershed, the more organic material is deposited in the lake. So really wet years, we tend to have lower transparency in the lake because it's like you're making the tea, you're steeping the tea bag longer. There's more organic material coming in the lake. During really dry years, like 2017, 2018, 2019 were dry years. There's not as much organic material being flushed out of the watershed, so the transparency is higher. In the 60s and 70s, the transparency of the lake was largely controlled by all these algae blooms. So that's why the transparency was low. Now that the algae abundance is down, the primary driver is dissolved organic material, and that fluctuates widely based on weather patterns, wet and dry years.
Is the lake clean enough for swimming? Well, I'd like to answer that and say yes, because I've done it.
Oh yeah,
But
definitely. Definitely.
good. Not that I've ever gone into a non-swimming area near the alumni campground ever.
Or off the point, which you can't.
No,
do
never, never.
No.
Has Kurt Steger done any core samples that would give clues to the bottom of the lake hundreds of years ago?
Yes, his class, his paleolimnology class, has collected data on that recently, last year. And I don't have that information on me, but I saw the presentation that his students did. And the signature from the sediments in the lake lines up very, very nicely with the history that we know of development on the lake.
Does the college still employ students as lake stewards to talk to recreational users? I know the answer, but
yes, the
Corey?
Baltic College Adirondack Watershed Institute, this summer, I believe it's over 100 lake stewards were hired, not just for this lake, but for lakes all over the Adirondacks. It's really the premier institute for lake stewardship and education that's being used as a model around the country.
yeah, it's quite a program. I remember the first year when I used to work in HR, and when I was there, we'd have, 10, 20 lake stewards
Right.
come in. And now, they get 150. They have to schedule them out over a few days to get them just
Right.
through payroll kind of stuff,
Yeah.
Any possibility of restoring O2 to lake bottom?
Well, that's something that our neighbors on Spitfire and Upper St. Regis have spent a lot of time investigating. It's incredibly cost prohibitive, especially for lakes of this size. It's different in like municipal ponds and golf courses and things like that, but it is a very large undertaking, and one that also has its own aesthetic drawbacks as well. Rafts of bubbling compressed air, and So there's been no push for it for that particular management strategy.
Okay. The environmental movement was the reason I went into the EET program in 1976. I'm sure we could hear that 100 times over.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, the right place at the right time. I mean, it was just perfect.
McKaylee from AWI says, we have more than 100 stewards. Training starts next week. Season starts Memorial Day. So yeah, it's a big program and pretty amazing. Brayton, Maine area, we are looking at laundry brighteners in lake samples to locate point sources of contamination.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. One of my colleagues here, Brendan Wilsey, told me a little bit about that. Looking for signs of laundry in water to try to pinpoint faulty septic tanks. I think that's really cool. It's really interesting. There's still quite a few antiquated septic systems on Upper St. Regis that many members of the community are concerned about. So there are still a handful of these old camp type systems that are operating.
Okay. Well, I'm not seeing any more questions. Oh, wait. I remember when the formula for laundry detergent changed to reduce the phosphorus content.
Yeah, you know, in the late 60s and early 70s, scientists had pretty well pinpointed that this issue was driven by phosphorus. Prior to that, there were a lot of other hypotheses. Maybe it was carbon, maybe it was nitrogen. But a series of really elegant experiments by David Schindler demonstrated that it was phosphorus, but that even though the science was there, recognition of that problem was slowed, and it was slowed by the detergent companies, because the detergent companies at that time used phosphorus as a binder, basically to take hardness out of the water so that you'd have more suds. Because the advertising agencies were advertising, you know, brighter brights, whiter whites, bigger suds. If it suds more, then it must be working better. So some of these detergents had up to 15% by weight was phosphorus. So, you know, it was a battle, just like we see battles now with changing climate against industry, or battles in the 80s for acid deposition against the power companies, you know, stalling the process, hindering the process for financial reasons. This happened with phosphorus as well.
Are
New
you
York
all?
State was the first state to ban phosphorus in detergents in 1972, I think.
Are you also monitoring other area lakes?
Yeah, so the Paulson's College Adirondack Watershed Institute has well over 100 lakes in the monitoring network. You know, probably 70 to 80 of those lakes are monitored routinely every year. Some other ones pop in and out, but yeah, we have an absolutely gigantic database of information on lakes. Absolutely.
Any microplastics in St. Regis?
I would imagine it seems that they are pervasive. Research is suggesting that it's a much bigger problem, and they're literally everywhere. But to my knowledge, that no one's actually tried to specifically address that question.
Okay. I want to share excellent narrative. Thanks, Corey. That's from Dr. Craig Maluski.
Who?
Yeah, that guy. Craig Maluski, you might know him. Ron Perlick says, fascinating. Thanks for the history and ecology lesson. I got to be honest, I was starting to get nervous. I hadn't taken notes. I thought there might be a test at the end. I would not pass it, though. I do like that you brought in the history. So while the photographs are very helpful for me, I'm very visual. So thank you for that, and tying it into things that as you may know, I'm a hotelie. So
well, you know, if you were an ET major in the 70s or 80s, this was part of your bread and butter. But since then, this sort of institutional knowledge is becoming rare, and so I'm glad to be the bearer cupbearer of this knowledge, because it's a really important story, both for the college and the role that it plays in the national environmental movement. I think it's really significant.
All Corey's programs need a pontoon boat for his classes. David Bly, you're something else. I am starting the Buy Corey a Research Pontoon campaign, looking for donation help.
Yeah,
That's great.
that's awesome, David. Yep.
And
I support your activities.
now Sue Alexander said GoFundMe. While I appreciate that, we could, beat the middleman and just call College Advancement.
Yeah, I think we can handle that one, Heather.
Yeah, I think maybe. Mark Caulfield, really, really good, Corey. You make me want to come back to school. Well, I know folks in admissions that can help make that happen.
Yeah, the graduate program.
Absolutely.
Good plug.
As we're winding down, this is the original EPA report for the lake. This was published after their first visit. This is their first publication of the National Eutrophication Survey, Lower St. Regis Lake. I've got here a follow-up report from 1977. So I've got a lot of these historical reports, plus boxes and boxes of these Lower St. Regis Lake research project reports that were generated by students. This is the first one, but we've got 20 of them, which is really cool.
That's awesome. I think after we get you a boat, maybe we could get ourselves a little museum on campus to put some historical documents.
We're all in a box about to go into the dumpster.
Oh
No.
And I didn't even know they existed. And I mean, I knew about the program. I didn't know any of these old reports existed. I'm like, these are cool old binders. Look at this. I mean, this is a really cool.
it's really cool. Yeah. I'd love to get my hands on
from 1970. I'm like, oh, this is awesome. And I open it up and I realize what it is. And I was like, oh, wow, it's something we got to hold on to.
Absolutely.
Corey, you're such a history nut. And I know when I first met you, we have such a common interest in history. So I love the way you tied the history into the science. And you make me want to go back to school as well. You're fantastic, man.
Yeah, I'm somewhat obsessed with Paul Smith's history. And often I spend more time thinking and looking at Paul Smith's history than doing my job that I get paid for, which can be a problem. So yeah, maybe next year or in the fall, we'll do another one of these and we can tackle a different question. I'm really interested in a lot of the history also of just the landscape around the college, how much the landscape has changed. And I don't mean necessarily cutting trees and clearing, but actually the physical landforms, how they've been moved and plowed. Lake levels have been dropped and fallen, raised, canals been built, dams. There was a dam on Cooler Pond, for example, at one time.
There you go, Heather. There's a topic for next fall.
All right, we'll sign them up. This is great. Craig Maluski says, agree with Steve. Corey has become our historian. Very important in environmental science and understanding legacy effects.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. So Mike Recklin, Craig Maluski, Kurt Stager, and myself, we actually sort of published a part of this story last year in the Adirondack Journal of Environmental Studies. So that's where a lot of this information came from, that collaboration with Craig and Recklin and Kurt. So the paper, Environmental History of Lower St. Regis Lake, Degradation and the Path to Ecological Redemption, is in print. So if you're interested in a copy, email Steve Frederick.
That's the other part of my job is being Corey's personal assistant and scribe. So yes.
Oh, good to
you
know.
contact me, we'll get you a copy.
Oh, yeah, or you can send me an email. I would be happy to send you a copy.
Believe it or not, I do have it saved in my file, Corey. I have that report saved. So yeah, I can get it out.
If you're really interested in the science of the lakes, my colleagues and I at the Adirondack Watershed Institute have released several of these reports. This is the State of the Lake report for St. Regis, for the St. Regis chain. New one is being written right now by myself, what I was doing right before. So we've got a number of these reports. So these are available on the Adirondack Watershed Institute website if you're interested in the science.
Excellent. Well, this was great. Thanks, Corey, for being our featured guest. We hope to have you back in the fall. Yeah, as everyone who's joining us tonight, we did record this. So if you missed something or want to go back and study up in case there is a quiz the next time, this recording will be available on the alumni webpage in about a week. It's hard to say for sure. Depends on a number of things. Got a comment here. Excellent presentation, science and history combined. I agree.
Thank you.
This was perfect. So thanks everyone for joining us. I think it's time that we get ourselves settled in for the evening. Some of us have a really long trip home. Wait, is that an award over your shoulder on that bench under the window, Corey? Do I see an award?
Yes.
Is that a recent award?
Yeah, it was from graduation this year.
Really?
Tell us about it,
You
Corey.
were there.
I know, I gave it to you.
Tell us about the
Yeah.
award, Corey.
Outstanding Faculty Member Award for 2020.
That is from the students.
Yeah.
That is amazing. When students
Well,
recognize
yeah, it
people.
turns
that-
out if you tell all your students to nominate you and in exchange, you'll give them an A, you're guaranteed to get that every year.
Oh, is that how it works? I had no idea. Now I know what to do next year.
I think it's pretty well earned, Corey.
Thank you.
I would agree. I would agree. Thanks so much for joining us, everyone. We'll see you on June 10th with Dan Kelting. And then again on June 24th with Mike Recklin and Paul Pillis.
That's an all-star lineup right there.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And then we're going to take a couple of months off and join you again in the fall when the faculty are all back and ready to present to us again.
Yeah, we have a little event coming up in July, don't we, Heather?
Gosh, in 71 days, whatever will I do?
Well, I
Oh,
can tell you, David Bly, class of 81, is so determined to attend his 40th anniversary. He's making sure that we have a reunion this year.
okay. All right. I like that plan. So in 71 days, we'll see David Bly along with all of his classmates. And you know, we'll see if we can get some more of those 15,000 alumni ready to come here. Hopefully not all at once. I don't know that we can handle 15,000 this year, but we'll see what we can do. But until next time, thanks all for joining us.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Corey and Steve. See you next
Fantastic,
week.
Corey. Thank you.
All right,
Thank you,
we'll see ya.
everybody.
I'm watching our chat just in case.
Yeah, that was Corey. That was awesome.
It was really good.
Even the non-scientists like you and I.
Well, the history part, I knew that you
Oh,
would be right in
Oh,
on
yeah.
it.
Loved it.
Absolutely.
I didn't realize how much of a mound or that was in front of the hotel that was
Right.
removed. And I think that topic of the landscape changes over the years would be fascinating.
Yeah, I think we should get the group of them together to do that. You know, maybe we could get them to do that in the fall for us. I have another idea too, but we won't talk about it now because I think I'm still recording.
You don't want to spoil the fun.
No, I don't want to spoil the fun. But all right, I'm going to stop recording. Good night, all.